are marking today All Saints' Day. It was actually November 1st. That's the date that is designated on the calendar. But we are marking it today, that day for remembering those nameless saints. All of those faithful people who never made it into the history book. And like I said, you have your collection of them, I have my collection of them. People like my dad, like my Grandpa Boythe, like my Grandma Belden. These people who formed and shaped my life in wonderful ways. My piano teacher and mentor in college, Nolan Isaac, oddly enough, the moderator of my very first church. Can you imagine a council president making the list of saints? Norm Gustafson is one of those people who shaped me, informed me, and helped me in wonderful ways during that first pastorate, and he is now one of those. And on Sunday mornings, they sit just out of sight right up there, and often I am keenly aware of their presence, especially on Sundays when we celebrate the Lord's Supper. I'm keenly aware that they are here. You have some of those people who have touched your lives too, people who loved us and taught us, people who showed us the way. And sometimes when we remember them, there are tears of joy and tears of thanksgiving. And it happens for me sometimes, especially at the table, when I'm keenly aware of those men and women who are just out of sight there. The saints who have shaped and formed and blessed and enriched my life. And sometimes there are tears because we feel their absence. Those of you who have endured death or other kinds of separation recently are keenly aware that those kinds of partings, those kinds of absences create some kinds of grief. And other kinds of partings too, the kind of parting that sort of lurks in the background of this congregation right now, with the announcement that Pam and I made several weeks ago. All of these separations create their own kind of pain. They create their own kind of sorrow, their own kind of grief. And they are all a part of life because that's part of who we are as human beings. If you are a philosopher, you use the word finite. Big fancy word that means there are all kinds of limits around us. We only live so many years. We can only be here. We can't be there at the same time. All of these kinds of limits and boundaries that are around us simply because we are human. We can't be like God, like God's Spirit, here and there and everywhere all at once. We are finite in time. We are finite in space. We are physically finite. There are limits to what our bodies are able to do. We are emotionally finite. There are limits to what we are able to endure. All of these boundaries are who we are because of them. There will always be partings. There will always be separations. We are in a way of life that leads to death in a variety of ways. And that is why, as the people of God, we often pull together and hold as dear treasures words like some of the words we heard this morning, those words that we heard from the prophet Isaiah, where Isaiah announced that God will destroy that shroud, that death shroud that we pull up over people's faces when they are dead. God will swallow up death forever. God will wipe away the tears from all of our faces. We embrace those promises and we treasure them because we know what death feels like. And those words from the Revelation, the wonderful understanding that John was given about what the end will be like, that new heaven and that new earth, that holy city, the new Jerusalem, where God will dwell with us and God will wipe away all of our tears, and death itself will pass away. Death itself will pass away. Anybody yearning for those promises to come true? They will. They will. Someday, maybe even soon for some of us in various kinds of ways, but they are not yet true, not yet embodied, not yet working, not yet fully true. Today there are still tears. Today there is still mourning. Today there is still pain. Today we still pull the sheet up over lifeless faces. Death still swallows people up, all kinds of death in all kinds of ways. Which is why I'm glad that we were able to hear today that piece out of John's Gospel. We jumped into the middle of the story about Lazarus. Jesus' friend Lazarus had died. Lazarus is the brother to Mary and Martha, and their home in Bethany was kind of a sacred place where Jesus would be able to come and rest and enjoy just normal kinds of fellowship with people who loved him and cared about him. So that was Jesus' retreat, and Lazarus and Mary and Martha were very dear to Jesus, and they had sent word to Jesus, Lazarus is sick, you better come, and Jesus didn't quite get there in time. So now it is 4 days later, Jesus comes to visit the grave. Jesus comes to be with Mary and to be with Martha. Death swallowed up his friend. Grief and sorrow have swallowed up his friends. And Jesus did not blow off the death Jesus did not blow off the grief. Jesus didn't say, well, now that I'm here, I'll wave some kind of magic wand and everything's going to be okay, because it is never okay with death. And Jesus knows it is not that simple. Jesus knows that not even God can sort of blow off death like it's no big deal. Jesus knows that. The weight of death, and the weight of grief, and the weight of sorrow, and the weight of parting, and the weight of loss. These are all weights that we know all too well, and they bear down on Jesus too in today's gospel. They bear down on Jesus just like they bear down on you, just like they bear down on me. And Jesus, according to the story as John tells it to us, was deeply moved and deeply disturbed in his spirit. He even began to weep. So-called shortest verse in the Bible we all learned in Vacation Bible School, so we could check off one more verse. Jesus wept. That verse is not a simple little verse you check off in Bible School to get one more notch on your chart. It's a powerful statement of Jesus' own passion and grief and agony and pain as he stood by the grave of his friend, as he stood with his friends who grieved that death. That matters to me. Maybe like this. There's a story about a little girl who was supposed to be home at a certain time, but she didn't come home, and she didn't come home, and she didn't come home. And she finally got home just before her mother was ready to get really nervous about this whole thing. And her mother gets after her. Why were you late? Why didn't you let me know what was going on? How come you didn't get home on time? And all that sort of thing. And the little girl says, because I had stopped to help a friend. My little playmate friend had dropped her doll, and the doll had broken, and so we picked the doll up, and we were trying to fix it. I was with her for quite some time, and so Mom sort of changed the tune and said, were you able to fix it? And the little girl said, no, we couldn't fix it, but I was able to help her cry. What we have just been remembering about Jesus is that kind of a thing. Isn't that what we feel when Jesus stops by to help us cry? Can't fix it, at least not right now, but he will stop by and then cry with us. Sometimes in the presence or in the embodiment of a Christian brother or a Christian sister who sits down beside us and grieves with us and helps us cry. Somebody who knows and somebody who feels and somebody who understands. And in their tears and in their presence, you sense the presence of Jesus. And you also know the rest of the story if we've gone on to read the rest of chapter 11. It's a very long story. As the story progresses, Jesus did in fact raise Lazarus from the dead, and we heard that part. But what we didn't hear is that the raising was heroic and intensely costly. If you read on to the end of chapter 11 and into chapter 12, you discover that because Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, this is already late in the game. Jesus is already on his way to his Passover journey in Jerusalem. It's late in the game, and the raising of Lazarus from the dead intensifies the leaders' urgency about getting rid of Jesus. We've got to get this guy out of the way before he does more things that convince more people to believe it. We've got to get this guy out of the way. And not only did they redouble their efforts to make sure they got Jesus out of the way, but now Lazarus, who is a living witness to his power, they got to put Lazarus back in the tomb too. So this was a costly act that Jesus did. Raising Lazarus up the ante against Jesus, and it put Lazarus in a really nasty predicament. There is nothing easy here. There is nothing magical. Even for God, death is costly. Even for God, it costs God everything. Any of you who has endured the death of a child know exactly what they're talking about. And so we are surrounded. We are surrounded by death. We are surrounded by party. We are surrounded by all of these ways that relationships and so on come to an end one way or another. And we are also surrounded by a God whose promises help us to defeat death. Jesus' presence and Jesus' tears help us believe and help us hope and help us know that God will do what God has called and what God has promised to do. And maybe it kind of works out for now like this. Another story. This one is a vacation Bible school story. In this particular vacation Bible school, the kids had made out of ceramic little plates or little trays and painted them all up and so on out of ceramic. And after the closing program of Vacation Bible School, the little guy runs down to where his little craft piece, his little ceramic tray was, and he was going to grab it and run back up and give it to his mother. And as he's running through the hallways down in the basement where all that cement floor is, he dropped the thing and it shattered into, I don't know how many pieces, a dozen pieces or more. So here is the gift that he was going to give to his mother, shattered all over the floor, a little piece of pottery. And people who were around him came up and said the kinds of nonsense that we say to each other when we don't know what to say. It'll be okay. It's not that big a deal. It's just a little, a little thing, whatever. And sort of made light of it. And of course, the boy is not at all comforted by any of that. The tears keep coming, and the tears keep coming. Finally, his mother comes down the hallway, and she sees what has happened. And so she says to her son, let's gather up the pieces, and we will put them in a bag, and we will take them home. And when we get home, we will glue them all back together as well as we can, and we'll see what we can make of it. We will see what we can make of it. Isn't that kind of the way it is? Isn't that kind of the way it is? We'll pick up the pieces and take them home and glue them back together and see what we can make of it. For the little boy, and sometimes for you, and sometimes for me, hasn't it been that way? And it will be that way again, maybe even today. And so pieces get glued together, and for the time being, we make of it what we can, and then we offer that piece back to God so that God can use it in wonderful ways. And so we end with this prayer. Come then, Lord, and help your people, the people bought with the price of your own blood. Bring us with your saints to glory everlasting.